Reading The Unknown Reality by Jane Roberts, a Seth book, Volume 2, Session 730. So, first of all, Rob inserts that after the last session, Jane had told Rob that, she says, "I've got it from Seth, I think. A really complete astrological chart would have to include not only the time of your birth, but that of your death." Jane's also getting that this session is going to be about astrology. And she says, actually, it's about the birth of consciousness. Okay, so Seth comes in and he says, usually you think in terms of hypothetical whole self or consciousness, emerging at birth and disappearing at death. There are, however, learned arguments in which professors debate such questions. Some astrologers use the time of conception in their calculations, while others prefer the date of birth. Various religions have decided that the quote-unquote soul enters the fetus at its conception, while others argue that consciousness cannot be considered a human soul until some time later, just prior to birth. The same kind of questions occur at the other end of the scale. When does death actually come? In most of these debates, this hypothetical self or consciousness is taken as the measure. In the first place, again, the self or soul in this case is not a thing of measurement, nor is it necessarily some thing that suddenly arrives and then disappears. The physical self, as you know it, is a focus of consciousness that forms a personality in response to that focus. It is very difficult to make analogies here, but I am foolhardy enough to try. It seems to you that any naturally aborted fetus has no physical life at all, that such life has been denied to it for some reason. Instead, the fetus experiences another level, physical life at a different scale, that in your terms would apply to the distant past. In, I repeat, conventional ideas of evolution, this would be a period in which your kind of consciousness experimented with a water environment, with fins instead of lungs. In certain terms, this gives the consciousness a look at particular portions of the species' quote-unquote past. It also provides that consciousness with first-hand knowledge psychically and directly. Again, most difficult to explain, particularly without offending your ideas of selfhood. Yet each of you, quote-unquote, alive, died in just such a manner. While in conventional terms you think of long centuries' duration, in which finned creatures rose from the sea, some, quote-unquote, becoming reptiles, and finally mammals. Many did not make that journey, but, quote-unquote, fell along the way. So, in those terms, and following that analogy, the psyche makes the same kind of adjustments, and life changes. You have each existed many times then as fetuses, quote, who did not make it, end quote. Not necessarily because you did not want to be born, but because those experiences were in themselves legitimate and in your present state are written in the quote-unquote memory of your physical being. Now, this does not mean that your personality as you know it was often trapped within a womb, destined to die there, or that a hypothetical whole self would not be born. It means that the archaeology of your psyche, as it is physically focused, carries those experiences. The self is not like a clay figure coming from a potter's oven, so that you can say, quote, here is a self, and nothing can be added to it, end quote. You have always existed as a probable self, though you were not focused in the knowledge of your own experience. You may have been focused quite well in other realities, but I am speaking of your earthly existence as you understand it. At any point now, you can literally become more yourself. In that regard, you are born by degrees. In certain terms, you have discarded portions of yourself, so you died by degrees, but the two, the living and the dying, occur at once. To a certain extent, what you are was latent in the fetus, but there is no one point when, quote, the full awareness of the soul enters into the flesh, end quote. The process is gradual. In physical terms, it begins before your own parents are born. The chart of events at the time of your quote-unquote birth is like one small snapshot of someone's backyard in the afternoon. Here, in this analogy, the entire earthly personality could be compared to the world. Now, as long as you make your own deductions according to that one picture, there will be correlations that apply, but only to that small specific area. In your terms, the person at birth is affected by multidimensional conditions, and the collective position of the planets is but one very minute indication of the other realities involved. Rupert is correct. Even in conventional terms, a true horoscope would have to involve the time of death in your temporal reality, as well as that of your birth. Your focus of attention forms boundaries that predispose you to believe in a point at which your consciousness emerges, as you understand it, and a point when it is no longer effective or dies. Your beliefs in such concepts limit your perception, for by altering the focus of your attention, you can, to some extent, become aware of perception before and after the recognized points of birth and death. You grant soulhood only to your own species, as if souls had sizes that fit only your own natures. You preserve these ideas by thinking of animals as beneath you. Then, however, you must wonder when the soul enters the flesh, or when the alien fetus becomes one of your own, and thereby blessed by the gods and granted the right to life. But all things have consciousness, and in those terms possess a soul nature. There are no gradations as to soul. Soul is the life within everything that is. Of course, the fetus, quote, has a soul, end quote. But in the same way, if you think in those terms, then the cell within the fetus must be granted a soul. The course of a cell is not predetermined. Cells are usually very cooperative, particularly as they form the structures of the body. But the body is a context that they have chosen to experience. In fulfilling themselves, the cells aid your own existence, but in a framework they have chosen. They can reject certain elements within their existences, however, change their courses, or even form new alliances. They have great freedom within what you think of as the framework of your reality. If their paths cannot be charted and can indeed constantly surprise you, then why do you think that your course can be mapped out ahead of time by reading the positions of the stars at your birth? The cells are not inferior as far as you are concerned, even though they form part of the structure of your physical being. They are not even less conscious. They are conscious in a different fashion. there is no need to quote-unquote romanticize them or to think of them as little people, but each of them possesses a highly focused consciousness and a consciousness of self. You like to think, again, that only your own species possesses an awareness of its own selfhood. There are different kinds of selfhood and an infinite variety of ways to experience self-awareness. As an example, it appears to you that animals do not reflect upon their own reality. Certainly it seems that a cell has no quote-unquote objective knowledge of its own being, as if it is without knowing what it is, or without appreciation of its own isness. You are quite wrong in such deductions. Nor are there necessarily gradations in which one kind of consciousness progresses in rigid terms from a lower to a higher state. Any cell has practical use of precognitive abilities, for example, that quite escape you, yet many of you assign such abilities to quote-unquote higher souls. Each kind of life has its own qualities that cannot be compared with those of others, and that often cannot be communicated. Now, all of this may seem to have little to do with the nature of reincarnation as you think of it, or with counterparts as I have explained them. Yet it is vital that you throw aside old concepts of the self and of the soul before you can begin to understand the freedom of your own selfhood. This evening, Rupert read some just published material about dolphins and whales. It contained strong hints that those creatures are geniuses, possessing the ability of abstract thought to a high degree. Such is indeed the case. Now, dolphins deal with an entirely different dimension of reality. There is, as yet, no method of communication that can allow you to perceive their concepts of selfhood or their collective vision of existence. They are sensitive, self-aware individuals. They are altruistic. They understand the nature of relativity, and they have different ways of passing on information to their young. They are not higher or lower than your own species. They simply represent a different kind of selfhood. Now, there is some relationship, at least in terms of our discussion, between the reality of the dolphins and the reality of the fetus. In your terms, the fetus lives in primeval conditions, reminiscent of periods in the species past. It relates in its own way to its own environment. Now, for some consciousnesses, this is sufficient. In your terms, again, for each of you, it was sufficient. The soul is not a unit that is definable. It is instead an undefinable quality. It cannot be broken down or built up, destroyed or expanded. Yet it can change affiliation and organization and its characteristics, while ever remaining itself. The soul within the fetus cannot be destroyed by any kind of abortion, for instance. Its process cannot be charted, for it will always escape such calculations. Its history is in the future, which always creates the past. It's a great freaking statement right there, right? Alright, so that's the end of the session, and there's a note here that says Jane was out of her very excellent trance at once. Quote, "That was one of those times when the material was coming through so great that I could have continued until morning. That feeling of freedom is fantastic." End quote. She said, then tried an analogy. Quote, I'm as free as a great runner who breaks a world record when her chest hits the tape, end quote. And Rob inserts also, he says, not only that, Jane now had several other channels of data available from Seth. Quote, God, I get impatient, end quote, she exclaimed. Quote, but in physical reality, I can get only one of them at a time, and you can write just one sentence at a time. Oh, forget it, Seth, end quote, she added, half laughing, for that, quote, energy personality essence, end quote, was ready with comments on what she just told me. Jane got up and walked around the living room, where we were holding the session. When she went into the kitchen, she picked up more from Seth on astrology. As break neared its end, Jane said that Seth was going to give the material available through one of the other channels open from him tonight. The decision was strictly her own, of course, and was motivated by a very successful out-of-body experience she'd had last night following ESP class. Jane was especially happy that today she had found interesting correlations with part of her adventure through a friend, who is also a class member. So, Seth returns, but Seth not only came through with the material Jane wanted, but devoted considerable time to other information for her. And in the notes it says that the information on astrology was received, but Rob never recorded it. So for post-session notes, we're going back to Appendix 12 for note number 1, which he's saying contains much material on conventional theories of evolution, as well as on Seth's and my own often countering views. Now, most of these session notes, let me just tell you, is going to be mostly you guys reading. But it's thoughts by mainly Rob here. So session note number 2. While Seth was giving his material on the fetus, Rob had found himself recalling some ideas he'd mentioned to Jane at various times during the last couple of years and have written about briefly. So this is his thoughts. You guys just gotta pause. Boom, it's right there. And pause, read. And it goes on. Pause, pause, pause. And there's the rest of it. Pause and read. Skipping note 3, skipping note 4, and just giving you some of note 5. Number 5, the superior intellectual and altruistic characteristics of dolphins and other cetaceans are well known, if barely understood in detail. And he's saying for Seth's final delivery in the 688th session, referred to again, Volume 1, Unknown Reality, Seth cited them as being not only similar to certain species that had lived on our own planet in the far past, but as representing bleed-throughs from probable realities in which water-dwelling mammals predominate. And I think we all pretty much know what Einstein's special and general theories of relativity is. That's note 6, but if you want to read it, go ahead, pause. And there's the rest of 6. And let's see. Note number 7 is just saying that Jane first experienced the multiple channel effect with Seth not long after she began delivering personal reality. Session 616 for chapter 2. And number 8, it says that Rob can add later that in chapter 17 of Jane's book Psychic Politics, she presented both her own notes on her out-of-body experience and the material Seth gave on it the next evening in the 730th session. So if you have that book, you might want to go to that chapter for that out-of-body experience. So that's the end of this session. And the next, all I have here is it's going to be about the quote absent self, end quote, we all seem to long for. And Rob says it's about the knowledge of your forefathers is within your chromosomes, reincarnation and other supports of selfhood, and we're going to get the plant analogy. So check back for the next video.